Welcome to the third session in this course on the emergence of barbarian Europe. Last week we spoke about the barbarization of the Roman Empire, and this week we will talk about the Christianization of the barbarians. This opening image, it's the Christian Martyrs' Last Prayer by Jean-Léon Jerome. It's a 19th century painting. Whether this particular act took place, and some of the furniture in this picture is from the Circus Maximus, and some parts of it look like the Colosseum, and the Christians tied to burning crosses. That's from Tacitus, I think, when Nero blamed the Christians for burning Rome. So it's a bit of a composite, and whether this particular act took place is not something I can say, but something like this did happen. For 3 centuries, Christianity was a persecuted faith in the empire. It was not continuously persecuted. There were long periods when the laws were inactive. Even when the laws were active, it was not always a very harsh persecution, but it is perceptions that matter as much as the true state of affairs where these things are concerned. If you are a Christian in about the year 350, maybe the year 400, maybe 450, if you're a Christian after the establishment of your faith and you look back, you do not look back on the pagan empire with great affection, because something like this did happen sometimes. If you were a devout Christian in the 4th and 5th century, you might have an ambiguous view of the preceding pagan empire. And this is something always to bear in mind. Although the emperors had become Christian, although the empire had been very heavily Christianized by about the year 400, it is not possible, except in the minds of 1 or 2 intellectuals around the emperor himself, it really isn't possible to speak of a total identification of the Western Empire and the Christian faith. Of the Eastern Empire, within 100 years beyond 400, maybe you can, because it will then have been 200 years after the establishment of Christianity, and it will be in a very heavily Greek-influenced civilization. But we must bear this in mind when we think about Christianity and the empire in the centuries after its establishment. And following on from the cover picture, here we have some quotes from Edward Gibbon. The progress of Christianity has been marked by 2 glorious and decisive victories over the learned and luxurious citizens of the Roman Empire and over the warlike barbarians of Scythia and Germany, who subverted the empire and embraced the religion of the Romans. Gibbon was a master of irony, and to say exactly what he thought of Christianity might have got him into court on a charge of blasphemy. And so Gibbon often makes his points by implication, but by the time he reaches chapter 71, he's able to say bluntly, "I have described the triumph of barbarism and religion." And he does so with consummate skill. It's just that some of us might not take the triumph of barbarism and religion as quite such awful things as he thought them. The new Europe that emerges after about the year 400, and when I talk about Europe, I must confess I'm talking about Western Europe. We must not forget that in the eastern province of the empire, things went on much as before. Indeed, they appear to have gone on rather better than before after 400. The new Europe, that is the new Western Europe. This is barbarian. It's not Roman, but it is still Christian. The barbarians have conquered the empire, or perhaps they haven't conquered the empire, perhaps they have simply settled the empire. They have taken over the empire. Oh, something has happened, but exactly what's happened is open to debate. One thing that is not in doubt is that whatever the barbarians did to the empire, the church has conquered the barbarians. The church is not a victim of the barbarian invasions. Let's have a look at why Christianity comes out on top in the great competition of religions that you see in the first few centuries of the Roman Empire. Christianity is different from other religions. In any one of these bullet points, you may say, well, there is Mithraism, there is the cult of Isis, there is the Sol Invictus. Yes, yes, in any one of those bullet points, Christianity may have a competitor. But when it comes to all of those put together, it is Christianity. Nothing else could come close to it in terms of the total package of what is offered to a convert. You have infinite rewards and punishments, which is always attractive, even if in a negative point. You also have a complete theory of history as a linear development. This is something that we take for granted. You may or may not be a believing Christian, but you live in a civilization where history is taken as a pretty straight line, even though it's been secularized in the past few hundred years. We don't think of history as a closed circle of endless repetition. You have an openness to philosophical speculation, which is a very important plus as far as Christianity is concerned. Most religions in the empire involved the unthinking performance of certain rituals. Although some intellectuals would try to find deeper meanings in these, there was not the same invitation to philosophical debate as you have in Christianity. An impressive literary tradition, and I'm going through this at the moment with my New Testament Greek class. The Gospels themselves are of very high literary quality, and the writings of the Apostolic Fathers are also above anything produced by the pagan intellectuals after about the 1st century. There are one or two continuing pagan classics, but most of Greek and Roman literature after about, shall we say, 150 AD is of declining quality, except for what is produced by the Christians. Close bonds of unity among the faithful, I'll come to that in a moment. A network of communities with internal government. Now that I'll come to in a few moments. Remember what I said at the beginning, that the persecutions were occasional and hardly ever severe. It was just the right level of persecution to keep the early church pure of worldly temptations. It was not a religion that people joined on the whole because they were on the make. There was always the chance that any benefits you got in the short term from becoming a Christian would be taken away from you by legal persecution. So the persecution was just enough to keep Christianity a pure religion, and it prevented any tendency to assimilation. A question about the doctrine of an afterlife. If you believe rightly or if you behave rightly, and Christianity has always been ambiguous on that, at least once you look at ordinary believers, if you believe or do the right things, you get an eternity of sitting beside Jesus Christ on that table in heaven. And if you don't do and believe rightly, or rather, if the people you don't like don't believe and do rightly, and the people you don't like never do or believe quite rightly, do they? Then they get an infinity of roasting in the lake of black fire. This is probably an abortive direction in the slideshow. What it does is to illustrate that as far as the Christians were concerned, the pre-Christian past was not something to be embraced with affection. You have a column in an Egyptian temple, the temple of Isis at Philae. You've got the great nephew of Augustus. You have Germanicus, the man who avenged the Teutoburger forest. And then you've got a statue of Augustus himself. Not that it looks to me like Augustus, but they have been purified, they've been cleansed of evil spirits by Christians by the carving of crucifixes into them. So Christians in the 4th and 5th centuries did not look back on the pagan past with automatic affection. This is a takeover by the Church of the Empire, and the question is, what next? I said that there were intellectuals in the emperor's own circle who believed in a total identification of faith and empire. Eusebius, Constantine the Great's religious advisor, the author of A History of the Church, a man of considerable ability, he insisted in his many voluminous writings that the establishment of Christianity had brought an indissoluble bond between faith and empire, and that the boundaries of the empire were now the boundaries of the faith. There was no need to go beyond the empire. Although it is a view that had a great deal of influence for a long time, it was not an opinion unanimously held. Let's have a look at the core doctrines. The commission text in Matthew. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. That's Matthew 28:19. That is the injunction that Christ laid on the apostles, and that is the injunction that he laid by extension upon the whole body of the faithful. You are to teach all nations. St. Paul elaborated on this. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither male nor female. For ye are all one in Christ Jesus. That's from Galatians. There you have two strict and apparently unambiguous injunctions to go out and preach the word without regard to the nationality or indeed the general condition of those to whom you're preaching. But, well, Christianity, although a proselytizing religion, was also in its earliest manifestations an urban religion. If you read Acts of the Apostles, you will see that Paul hurries from city to city as he travels around Asia Minor and Greece. You never see at any point Paul stopping off in the fields and talking to farm workers. The countryside is something through which Paul travels. He travels along the roads, never stepping off them. He travels between city and city, never paying any attention to the areas between those cities. Even after the establishment of Christianity, although much effort was made to Christianizing the towns, and that appears to have been on the whole successful, almost no effort went into evangelizing the country districts. And we've got a number of rather late pieces of evidence here. 598. Two texts from 598. This is nearly 200 years after Christianity. No, it is nearly 300 years, forgive me, after Christianity was made the official faith of the empire. De Correctione Rusticorum, a text from Portugal, complaining that country people are still worshipping stones and trees. Well, that's rather a distant part of the empire. Indeed, it hasn't been in the empire for well over 150 years. But again in 598, Pope Gregory the Great, he laments that country people just 50 miles from Rome are doing the same. They're worshipping stones and trees. They haven't been touched by the priests. 633 Council of Toledo forbids bishops, priests, deacons, or any other clerical orders from consulting magicians, augurs, diviners, or soothsayers. So Christianization is hardly tried on the country districts, and it often sits rather light even on those who hold holy orders. Even a long time after the establishment of Christianity, there was a lot to do within the empire. There are many people to be evangelized before you turn your attention outwards. Indeed, two other texts in the blue boxes on the right. This is E.A. Thompson, A History of Attila and the Huns. Throughout the whole period of the Roman Empire, not a single example is known of a man who was appointed bishop with the specific task of going beyond the frontier to a wholly pagan region in order to convert the barbarians living there. On the whole, I think Thompson is right. And then you have Augustine on the end of the world. Augustine is arguing against those people who say the end is nigh. Augustine says, no, the end is not nigh, because there are among us, that is, in Africa, innumerable barbarian tribes among whom the gospel has not yet been preached. Yet it cannot be rightly said that the promise of God does not concern them, because the Lord did not promise the Romans, but all nations, the seed of Abraham. Augustine is making the point that the barbarians should be evangelized, but it's an ambiguous point because he is mentioning those barbarians who are inside the empire. What I'm saying is that on the one hand, Christianity is a proselytizing religion. There are unambiguous injunctions by Christ himself and by St. Paul: go out and preach the word regardless of the condition of those to whom you are preaching. Yet at the same time, the evangelization of the early church was partial and imperfect even within the empire. It applied to the city districts, not to the country districts, and it was far from complete even among those who were ordained. When the barbarians moved en masse into the western provinces, the church was not very well set up to convert these people, but converted they were. Now, once you go east beyond the frontiers of the empire, you do see an impressive record of conversion. When you go into Mesopotamia, that's an area stretching down towards the Persian Gulf, and when you go beyond that to India and even to China, you are moving into civilized areas with extensive levels of urbanization. Christianity is planted in these eastern places, and it flourishes within the cities just as it does in the empire itself. Indeed, it seems that Christianity did at least as well in Mesopotamia as it did in the empire itself. In Mesopotamia, it had the great advantage that the region was ruled by the Parthians and then by the Persians, who were a great deal more tolerant of Christianity than the empire was. And then after the establishment within the empire, the Persians were a great deal more tolerant of heresy than the Roman authorities were. And although it's difficult to do more than guess, I think it is a fair guess that on the eve of the Islamic conquest, Persia was ready for a Christian takeover. So Christianity was not a religion purely within the Roman Empire. It grew up in the first instance within the empire, and because the holy places were within the empire, Christians tended to look towards the empire. But there were substantial Christian communities in Persia, in the Persian Empire rather, and in India, and even far off in China. We must forget any idea that the barbarians wanted to destroy the empire. It was not on their agenda. crossing those river frontiers and burning and looting and killing and all the usual horrors, those were plan B for the barbarians. Plan A was that they wanted to join the empire. They admired it. They served it as soldiers. Increasingly from the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman armies were heavily recruited from the barbarian regions beyond the Rhine and Danube. And as I keep on saying, they gave very good service. The barbarians wanted to serve the empire. They wanted to join the empire. They may perhaps have wanted a privileged status within the empire, but destruction of the empire was not on their agenda. It's not something they wanted to do. The barbarians, from the moment they reached the river frontiers, they found themselves subject to continual and pervasive cultural influence from Rome. Rome was the sun to which they looked. All good things came from the empire. Wine, nice clothing, olive oil, all the good things of life were to be had within the empire. Of course, given the wrong circumstances, you'd break across the frontiers and take the good things. But on the whole, you wanted those good things in return for your own services. Because the barbarians are subject to this continual and pervasive cultural influence, as Rome becomes Christian, so the barbarians will become Christian. The imperial armies were increasingly recruited from the barbarians, and so as the armies were increasingly Christianized, so the barbarians were Christianized. There was from the very beginning a process of informal evangelization across the frontiers. It may be that the bishops had no particular interest in evangelizing the barbarians, but there is no doubt that individual Christians did so, and that they did so with considerable success. If you remember back to last week, we saw those maps of the Gothic incursions into the empire in the 260s, where they even built a fleet and got as far as Crete and Cyprus. They went back beyond the Danube with large amounts of booty and large numbers of captives whom they sold into slavery or kept as slaves. Many of those were Christians, and those Christians set about converting their masters, and they did so with success. Why should the barbarians convert? Much the same reason as why the citizens of the empire should convert. Christianity offers a coherent and integrated narrative of the world. It offers this to the illiterate and the educated alike. It assures everyone's salvation, and it tells people of what must be done in order to ensure salvation. It provides rituals to ease you through all the stations of life: baptism, weddings, and of course the funeral service at the end. You have the assurance of magic and miracles for those in need. You've got hope, and you have an entire technology of solace. You have books, relics, crosses, and these are all there to help you to understand and manage life. And if you are at the top of barbarian society, if you're one of the pagan rulers, why not? Conversion is an entrance into the legacy of Roman civilization. If you come across the Rhine and you settle northern France, if you are a pagan, worshipping whatever pagans worshipped at this time, it will be difficult for your new subjects to invite you to those elegant dinners. It will be possible, but it will be difficult, because by now everyone in northern France is Christianized, or at least all of the respectable people are Christianized, all the city people are, and there is a barrier between you and your new subjects. If, on the other hand, you convert, even if you convert to one of the heretical denominations, then you're in. You can be invited to dinner and you're one of them. Oh, your new subjects may write nasty poems about you. How can I write verses with 6 feet when I'm surrounded by yellow-haired 7-foot-high barbarians? They may say all sorts of nasty things about you, but they do accept you as Christians. If you convert as well, you gain an entrance to the club of Mediterranean rulers. You're accepted by the established elites. The question is not why should the barbarians have converted. The much better question is why should they not have converted. Methods of conversion, I'll let you read that for yourself. Nowadays, if you go out to convert people and they believe something else, you'll try to explain to them, well, Christianity is better than your present religion, or you might say, that there is no spirit dwelling in that piece of rock which will make the crops grow. You are deluded. It's just a piece of stone. Whereas the early Christians, they accepted that the pagan gods existed, and they accepted that there was something supernatural about trees and stones. But what they said was, these are the dwellings of demons, and the gods that you worship, it doesn't matter how beautiful the statues are, the gods behind those statues are hideous demons who have put on fine appearances simply to ensnare you. It was a very good conversion tactic. You do not deny the existence of other gods. You just insist that they are demons and that it's necessary to abandon these as soon as possible. The conversion of the Goths. I said that when the Goths invaded the empire in the 3rd century, they went back with captives whom they kept as slaves. A child of 2 of these Roman captives is a man, Ulfilas, 311 to 383. His parents had been enslaved by Goths in the raids of the 3rd century, and his parents and then he set about the evangelization of the Goths. Ulfilas translated the Bible into the Gothic language, inventing a new alphabet in order to do so. He was not initially enormously successful, and eventually in the 350s he asked Constantius II for the right for himself and his followers to enter and settle within the empire. But eventually he was entirely successful. His Gothic translation of the Bible became the Bible for the entire Gothic nation. He was an Arian. That is, he took the minority view, or he took the dissenting view on the relationship between Christ and God. I don't need to go into that, but the Arian dispute complicated relationships between the Romans and the Christianized barbarians for about a century and a half. But this was a short-term problem. One after the other, the barbarian nations adopted Arian Christianity, and then after a century or so of maintaining it, they converted to Catholicism, starting in the 510s with the Burgundians and ending in the 580s with the Visigoths in Spain, again converting from Arian to Catholic Christianity. But rather than focus on the accidental fact that Ulfilas was a heretic, the important thing to bear in mind is that this man, without any encouragement or indeed permission from the church authorities within the empire, set about the conversion of the Goths, and his conversion attempts were a complete success. So much so that when the Goths took Rome in 410, they respected the sanctity of the churches. Here are pages from the Gothic Bible. On the left you have the original alphabet invented by Ulfilas. It is based on the Greek alphabet, as you can see. On the right, this is Gothic. It's the Gospel according to Mark chapter 10, and this is Gothic. It is an early dialect of German. We don't have all of the Bible, and Ulfilas didn't translate the Book of Kings because he said the Goths already had enough to do with killing and fighting, so he wouldn't encourage them by translating the more bloodthirsty text in the Old Testament. But it is a valuable translation from a linguistic point of view. The conversion of the Irish. Now that is a very significant event. Patricius, or Patrick, was an Englishman or a Welshman who was kidnapped as a boy, taken across the Irish Sea and sold as a slave. After about 6 years in captivity, he escapes and comes back to Britain, which by now is still a Roman province. It's just that all of the Roman armies have been withdrawn in order to do service in the Rhine provinces. But it is still a Roman province. Patrick comes back, but he has a vision, and he's told to go back and to evangelize the Irish. And so that's what he does. First of all, Palladius is appointed the Bishop of Ireland, or the Bishop of the Irish. He then dies and is replaced by Patrick, who during his long life does a complete job. He appears to have converted the whole of Ireland. So much so that Irish or Celtic monks played an important role in reconverting northern England. What makes Patrick so important is that he is the first example, or perhaps Palladius before him, but it doesn't matter. The evangelization of Ireland, whoever did it, is very important because this is the first time that the church formally reaches out beyond the frontiers of the empire and seeks to convert a barbarian people. It does so after about 430 in Ireland, and it does so with complete and permanent success. One of the models established in Ireland is the building of monasteries. The Christians move into a new area. They begin the work of evangelization, but they also build a monastery, and the monastery is there as a permanent religious center. This is a model that was followed very heavily in the later conversion of Germany. Conversion of the Franks. At the end of the 5th century, Clovis, the pagan king of the Franks, is in a tight spot, and he promises, if I can beat the Alemanni, if I can beat these people, if I can have a victory, I will convert to Christianity, and I will convert to Catholic Christianity. He gains the victory he wants, and on Christmas Day 499, Clovis and 3,000 of his warriors are baptized into the Catholic faith by the Bishop of Reims. Here are some of the representations over the centuries of the conversion of Clovis, all the way through to this rather grand painting from the 19th century. But it's always the same. It is Clovis being baptized by a bishop. The significance of this is that Clovis was their first Catholic king, and so they will make a big fuss about his baptism. But the general significance of what happens with Clovis is that for the first time you have a barbarian ruler of a district inside the empire who is a Christian, and not an Arian Christian, with whom there'll always be a certain distance. He is a Catholic Christian, which means that he will often be more orthodox than the emperor in Constantinople, who will often need to trim towards the Arians or the Monophysites. Clovis, or his successors, the kings of the Franks, are unambiguously Catholic. And you have the beginning of a tight bond between the Franks and the papacy. For the first time, the barbarians are not just inside the empire and to be tolerated by the church. they are not barbarians. They are brothers in Christ. They are full members of the Catholic Communion, and they are, in many respects, more acceptable than the Greeks to the east, who are Roman citizens. That is the significance of Clovis. The Huns. The attempts to convert the Huns are a failure from beginning to end. A lot of effort is made, but the Huns are so mobile and they move through such unpleasant climates that missionaries have trouble keeping up with them. Also, the Huns, they seem on the whole to be impervious to a message of peace and love, and so the Huns come, the Huns go, and they take very little in the way of Christian conversion with them. Let's come to a very important part of Christendom. When the Roman armies are withdrawn from Britain in 410, the whole territory remains a Roman province. It just happens to be an undefended Roman province, or a set of Roman provinces which are undefended. Over the next century or so, these Roman provinces in Britain are invaded and settled by the Jutes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Frisians. They're settled by people from Holland, Denmark, and North Germany. These people are not Christians, and so Britain ceases to be a Roman and a Christian territory in the 5th century. We don't know to what extent this happened, because this part of English history is a bit of a mystery, but I think it's possible to say that England ceased to be part of Christendom for nearly 2 centuries. Then you've got Gregory and the English boys. Do you all know that story? About 580, 570, 580, Gregory, a Christian priest, is walking through Rome, and the slave dealers are holding their market, and there are some very pretty boys, blonde hair, upright, that's it, sort of clean, upright young lads being sold as slaves in the market in Rome. Gregory, he stops and looks at them and says, "Where are these from?" And the slave dealer says, "They are from England. They are Angli." Gregory says, "They are Angli, but they have the faces of Angelorum. They are English, but they have the faces of angels. It is terrible if they should be sunk in the darkness of heathenism." There's no evidence that Gregory buys these boys and sets them free, but he does decide that it would be a good idea to send missionaries off to England to bring it back into the fold of Christendom. It takes him a while to get round to this. Not until he is actually the Pope does he do it. And here are some 19th and early 20th century representations of this meeting between Gregory, later on Pope Gregory, and the English boys. In 597, Augustine, no relation to the author of the City of God, he's sent out by Gregory, and he arrives in Kent. He turns up in Richborough, which is about 6 miles from where I'm sitting at the moment. He arrives in Richborough, and he proceeds to meet Ethelbert, King of Kent, himself a pagan, but his wife Bertha is a Christian herself. Augustine and Ethelbert make an agreement. Augustine will be allowed to set up his mission in Kent. He'll be allowed to rebuild Canterbury. The progress of Augustine's mission is generally successful. Christmas Day 597, Ethelbert and 10,000 of his English followers convert, and Kent is soon Christian. Augustine and his priests go around Kent, cutting down the sacred trees and getting everybody, and we are talking about country districts now because there are no cities in England. Augustine sets about getting everybody into the new churches. And from Kent, the faith spreads out through the rest of the country. 604, King Cybert of the East Saxons converts, and he builds a church in London, which appears to have been a heap of ruins at the time, though it's always hard to say to what extent London was abandoned. 605, King Redwald of the East Angles converts. It seems that he later abandons Christianity, and he may be the pagan king buried at Sutton Hoo. The Sutton Hoo finds are very well displayed in the British Museum, and they are worth seeing because they testify to the rapid Christianization of England after the barbarian invasions. Indeed, at the bottom of this slide I mentioned Bede, a Northumbrian monk, 672 to 735, an historian and the author of the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. It is one of the greatest historical works of the Middle Ages, and it is a model of Latin prose. Something that's worth saying about the English and the Irish Christians is that unlike the Christianized barbarians on the continent, and unlike the descendants of Roman Christians on the continent, the English and the Irish were barbarous. We had lost, or in the Irish case, never acquired, the use of Latin. And so from the very beginning, we wrote either in our own language, in English, or when we did write Latin, we learned it as a completely foreign language. And two things come out of this. The first is that if you want to look at examples of early French, early Italian, early Spanish, you will struggle to find anything from before about the year 1100, because everyone who could write, or everyone who did write, wrote in Latin. It's only after about 1100 when those vernacular languages were thought worth writing, whereas the earliest examples of English are from about 400 AD. So we have a complete history of English in our literature. The other thing worth mentioning is that because we were so barbarous, because we didn't speak as our vernacular language anything which had grown out of Latin, when we did learn Latin, we learned it as a dead language, and so you'll find that the Latin written by Bede is a great deal more classical, a great deal less, I won't use the word polluted or contaminated, a great deal less influenced by the spoken language than you see in people like Gregory of Tours, or even Paul the Deacon, an historian whom I have always admired and enjoyed. So England becomes almost at once not just an afterthought of Christendom. England becomes a fully integrated part of Christendom, and England becomes a very important part of Christendom. And I'm not forgetting Ireland either. But part of the significance of England is that once the priests had finished doing the basic work here, young Englishmen were trained as missionaries and sent off into Germany. Germany was largely evangelized from England. It was not evangelized from France or from Italy, though it was done with the full knowledge and consent and cooperation of the papacy. But Germany was, in the first instance, evangelized from England. Gregory the Great set about the evangelization of England after 597, and then 100 years later, when England was fully evangelized, the English missionaries went off and repeated the process in Germany, and then eventually the German missionaries went off and did the job in Northern and Eastern Europe. What you have within a few centuries is a change of heart and a change of process. When the barbarians first crossed the Rhine and Danube, the church had not yet decided on the fullness of its mission. It had not yet evangelized the whole empire, and it had deliberately, it seems, left out the country districts, which were the overwhelming majority of the imperial population. The church's evangelization of the barbarians was slow and hesitant, and it was often done by private initiative, not by the church itself. But by the time you get to 597 and the arrival of Augustine in Kent, the church under Gregory the Great has become a proselytizing, a campaigning church. It is sending out missionaries to take back areas into Christendom that seem to have been completely lost. It does so with considerable success, and what the church has set up is a self-replicating model of conversion. The missionaries go into one area, they build the monasteries, they educate the boys, they Christianize, and then when their basic work is done, from the locals are recruited more missionaries who are sent into a new territory, and so it continues. Indeed, so it continues to this day. The Christian church, as established by Constantine, seems to have been the church of the Roman cities and of nothing else, despite the clear words of both Christ and St. Paul. It took several centuries before the church got into its stride as the conqueror of regions undreamed of by Caesar and Augustus. But it got there long before the year 800. As far as Western Europe is concerned, all distinction between Roman and barbarian has been effaced. Western Europe is Christian. It is Catholic Christian. Now, I seem to have finished rather early for once. Or have I finished? Oh, no, I haven't entirely finished. One Christ, different views. This is worth looking at. Now, here are two statues of Christ. They're both of Christ as the Good Shepherd. The one on the left is from about 300 AD in Rome. This is probably from just before the establishment of the faith by Constantine. The one on the right is from about 200 AD, at a time when Christianity was an occasionally and a mildly persecuted faith and never likely to be the established faith of the empire. But have a look at Christ as seen by the early Christians of the empire. He is the Good Shepherd. He is young. He is a civilian shepherd. And then have a look at Christ as depicted by the Germans in about 800 AD. This is from the time of Charlemagne. Christ as an heroic warrior. The barbarians were converted by the church, but the church in Western and Northern Europe insensibly moved away from the kind of church that would have been recognized by the earlier Mediterranean Christians. It is moving towards the kind of church that you see at the beginning of the Crusades, the church militant, in which all of the injunctions that Christ made against violence have been very carefully explained away. I'll make no comment on that. It may be that the injunctions that Christ made against violence are completely unworkable, a bit like the injunctions against lending money at interest that you find in the Old Testament now and again. It may be that it is necessary to explain much of this away, not all of it, but perhaps much of it. The work started as soon as Christianity was established. You have people like Augustine explaining, well, Christ did not mean that you must turn the other cheek when the barbarians come at you. I'm afraid you have to start some work of defence. And it proceeds through the Stuttgart Psalter in about 800 AD and goes all the way up to Urban II when he preaches the first crusade against the Muslims who have taken Jerusalem. A discussion of the imagery of Christ through the ages. Yes, one of the earliest representations of Christ, apart from those statues, is, there we are. That's Christ. That's
6th century, isn't it?
It is, yes. It's from the Church of St. Catherine in the Sinai Desert, I think. Yes.
It is, yeah.
Yes. This is after those classicizing statues from 300 and 400 AD, but this is probably roughly what Christ looked like, wouldn't you agree? What I'm doing is I'm going back and imposing a structure on past events that may not have been so evident at the time, but it does seem, when you look at late paganism, all paths do lead to Christianity, I think. The philosophical movement, Neoplatonism, they incorporate seamlessly with a lot of Christian doctrine, and the more popular worships of the unconquered sun, those blend in perfectly with Christianity. Christianity seems to be the natural stopping point of all of the later pagan religious movements, but that may be an illusion caused by the fact that Christianity was the one that got established. Perhaps if Constantine had said, well, I know this may come as a bit of a surprise, but I feel rather Jewish. It may be that now we'll have spent 1,000 or so years connecting later paganism with Judaism, and Christianity would be seen as a rather interesting but abortive heresy, rather as we look back on some of the early failed heresies, things like Marcionism or Pelagianism. A question about Britain as part of the Roman Empire. Britain was a fully integrated part of the Roman Empire before it was invaded. Then, within a few centuries, it was again a fully integrated part of Christendom. But there is that 2 centuries of relative darkness. We'll talk about that. Now, next week, I think what we'll do next week is we'll do the Goths in Italy. It's rather a sad story. The Goths in Italy made such a wonderful start. It was all ruined by that beast Justinian, who wanted to reconquer it. He couldn't reconquer it very well, instead he ruined it, and the Goths were swept aside. And then the people who swept the Goths aside were swept aside in turn by the Lombards. I suppose it had a happy ending, because the Goths, the Lombards, the Italians, they all blended eventually into the Italian nation of the Renaissance, but there was a great deal of bloodshed along the way.